Conflict continues to escalate across the world as the world seems more dangerous than ever. The war in Gaza has passed the grim milestone of 100 days. The death toll reaches more than 24,000 casualties.
Well, tensions have now spilled over to other areas in the Middle East, to Lebanon, Yemen, Iran and the Red Sea.
Now, in the last few days, UK-US airstrikes have targeted around 90 Houthi positions in Yemen after weeks of rebel attacks on shipping in the region.
And today, the Defence Secretary, Grant Shapps, is expected to announce that Britain will send 20,000 troops to one of NATO's biggest military drills since the Cold War.
Focusing on Eastern Europe, it aims to prepare for potential aggression from Russia as the war in Ukraine shows no sign of slowing.
But is military aggression actually the solution, or do the protesters over the weekend have a point calling for a ceasefire?
Or is it now more important than ever to invest in our military to be able to defend the world?
Well, let's bring in our digital political editor, Millie Cooke. Good morning to you. Look, it certainly feels as though there are threats on so many fronts. Is this Britain getting on the front foot, though, by sending out our troops to join this big NATO defence scheme?
That's exactly what Grant Shapps is expected to be saying later today. He's going to be talking about how the UK will be leading its allies when it comes to defending the West. And the language he's using is expected to be very strong when it comes to global instability. We're going to see Grant Shapps talking a lot about how the world's in a new era when it comes to instability. And he's also going to point out things like the fact that there are tanks literally on Ukraine's doorstep. So it's going to be a very strong speech. And it's also been echoed by quite a few other cabinet ministers. We had David Cameron out over the weekend talking about how the red lights are flashing on the global dashboard when it comes to instability. Obviously, given the timing of the speech as well, it's no surprise that we're getting strong language from the government. Obviously, just a few days ago, we saw the government authorise strikes on Houthi rebels in Yemen, and on the same day authorise a further £2.5 billion for Ukraine in order to defend against Russian aggression. So it really is a tricky time for the world, and it's getting increasingly unstable, and that's exactly the kind of language we will be seeing from Grant Shapps this evening.
And of course, we've seen a situation overnight when the Americans have intercepted a missile in the Red Sea. We've got concerns there as well. Do we think that British action, and we're going to be hearing a statement in the Commons today about that and what happened last week, is this actually making the situation any safer, or is it, as the UN have claimed, actually leading perhaps to an escalation in the region?
I mean, the government is currently arguing that they themselves aren't causing the escalation, that the escalation was caused by, in Yemen, say, the Houthi rebels increasing the frequency and the intensity of their attacks on what are often civilian targets. So the government's really arguing that they are just responding to an escalation that was already happening. And David Cameron over the weekend was saying that not acting is also a policy in itself. So they would be sort of letting it continue to escalate, and they are trying to avoid that escalation by pushing back against the rebels.
Yeah. Who are the Houthis anyway, Millie? The point is, why should we be even debating them? Why don't they just fire a few missiles and wipe them off the face of the planet?
I mean, obviously, with anything like this, you've got to be very cautious with military intervention. But at the moment, the government's arguing that it will have a severe impact on UK trade, and it could push up oil prices because the Houthi rebels were conducting attacks on trade targets and ships in the Red Sea, which could have an extremely detrimental impact on the global economy.
Millie, I'm just looking at the Daily Telegraph this morning. I have to ask you about this latest YouGov poll, which will make worrying reading for the Prime Minister. They're claiming that the Tories are facing a 1997-style wipeout, and inside listing a number of the big beasts within the party whose seats are seriously under threat, including the Defence Secretary, who we'll be speaking to a little bit later on, and the Chancellor, Jeremy Hunt.
It is really not a good outcome for the Tories. The polling this morning, which is, I think it's argued it's the most extensive polling in the last 5 years, and it shows just massive wipeout for the Tories. They would lose half of the seats they won in 2019, and it shows that almost 11 cabinet ministers would be removed from their seats. So it really is, it would be a devastating outcome for the Tories. And even this morning, we've seen the response from Conservative MPs on Twitter. It's almost meltdown in the Tory party. We had Simon Clarke, a former minister, demanding that the government fix its migration policy in order to tackle this issue and to try and turn around the Tories' fortunes for the next election. We had Zach Goldsmith almost joking about the fact they removed Boris Johnson, and now they're seeing devastating polling. So within just a few hours of that poll coming out, we've already seen a sort of the party going into flux this morning, but it sort of marks no change from what we've seen in the party in recent months.
The interesting thing about this, Millie, is this isn't necessarily because people believe Labour would do a fantastic job or that it's been driven by Labour popularity. This is just rubbish policies by the government and people's dissatisfaction with net zero, for instance.
Yeah, very much so. There seems to be a lot of apathy towards Labour, and it doesn't seem like people are actively voting for the Labour Party, but a lot of it is around just sort of fury at how the Conservatives have handled things like migration. And that's especially, you can really see that when you look at the number of people that are considering defecting to Reform. And a lot of seats across the UK, many of these are cabinet ministers that are going to be removed from their seats if this polling is to be trusted. A lot of them will be removed by a lot of the vote share going to Reform and splitting that Conservative vote, meaning that Labour's allowed to step in and take the seat.
And Millie, I was going to say that brings us on to discussing the kind of divisions within the Tory party. If Reform is actually the biggest threat to Conservative success, that is why many would argue the Prime Minister has to take these rebel amendments seriously. It's returning for another hearing, another reading in the Commons, I think Wednesday this week, the Rwanda bill. Lee Anderson, actually, the deputy chairman of the party, saying, you know, he wants to see these amendments brought in and he would vote down the current bill in its current form. I mean, how on earth do you win an election with these kinds of factions?
I know the splits in the Conservative Party right now are extremely deep, and we've got almost 60 MPs saying they'd back rebel amendments on the right, which would toughen up the Rwanda legislation. But then you've also got MPs like Robert Buckland on the more moderate wing of the party arguing that they would vote against the bill entirely if any of these amendments go through. He argued that the bill itself already goes too far, and if any of those amendments go through, it takes it completely beyond the point of no return. So the splits are so deep that you've got MPs on both sides saying that if the other side goes through, they just will completely turn their back on the legislation. So it is a precarious position for the government, and it really highlights how there is literally no agreement on the one issue that matters so much to voters.